The mess hall was louder than it had been in weeks, the kind of noise that bounced off every steel surface and turned a simple meal into a storm of voices, clattering trays, and the heavy shuffle of boots across the concrete floor she had chosen. The corner seat on purpose, hoping it would shield her from the restless energy of the recruits who filled the room. But the corner did little to protect her from the waves of curiosity that soon rippled her way as if some unseen signal had passed. Between the recruits drawing their attention to her and her alone, she kept her head down, pushing the last bite of bread across her tray, pretending she had not noticed the shift, but deep down she could feel the weight of their stares pressing. Into her skin, one by one, the nearest recruits began to move closer, first casually, as if they only meant to find seats nearby. Then with more purpose until it was no longer coincidence that she was surrounded. Their uniforms brushed against the side of her chair, their elbows knocked against the edges of her tray, and the space she had carved out for herself shrank with every second she told herself it was nothing. Maybe they were just restless. Maybe they wanted the corner too, but when one of them whispered her name softly enough that only she could hear. She froze the fork halfway to her mouth because she had never told anyone her name since the day she arrived at the camp. The whisper spread like a spark in dry grass. Soon others repeated her name. Their voices hushed, yet charged with something she could not decipher, awe or suspicion, or perhaps a dangerous mixture of both. Her throat tightened and her pulse thudded hard as she forced herself to look up and meet their gazes. Their faces were unreadable, their expressions caught between curiosity and something darker. She wanted to speak to ask them how they knew her name, but the words caught on her tongue, and instead she sat rigid as the recruits closed the circle around her, leaving no room to slip past. The clatter of trays grew louder as more recruits abandoned their meals to crowd near the corner, some still chewing food with distracted faces, their eyes never leaving her. She felt the air thicken with tension, the kind of tension that sparks fights or confessions, but she did not know which way this one would break. She remembered the warning she had been given on her first day. Keep quiet, keep your head down, and never let them find out who you are yet. Here she was cornered by dozens of recruits who seemed to know exactly who she was, without her saying a word. A tall recruit with cropped hair leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the murmurs around him. He asked her if it was true, and the way he said it told her that he already believed it was true. She swallowed hard, her mind racing through possibilities. What truth? What secret? What rumor could have spread so far when she had spoken to no one but the instructors? The recruits waited for her to answer, every pair of eyes locked on her, and she felt like a specimen trapped under glass. The silence after his question pressed against her ears until she could barely hear the scrape of boots behind her. She considered standing up, pushing through the crowd and running for the door, but as she shifted in her seat, she saw that the exits were no longer clear. Recruits had drifted into position by instinct or design. She could not tell their bodies, forming barriers that would make it impossible to escape without a fight, and even if she fought her way out, she would never outrun all of them. Her only choice was to stay seated, to hold her ground, and try to speak. But when she opened her mouth, no sound came out, only the sharp taste of fear that coated her tongue. Then the mess hall doors slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows and drew every head around. The recruits turned back almost in unison, their attention snapping from the door to her. As if the noise had confirmed something they already suspected, she could feel her heartbeat thundering in her ears, louder than the whispers that now spread again, faster and sharper than before. Her name echoed over and over until it sounded strange to her, like it belonged to someone else and not to the girl trapped in the corner of the mess hall. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to make sense of what they wanted, but each second stretched longer until she thought she might break under the pressure. Another recruit stepped forward, his tray still in his hands, the food untouched, his gaze fixed on her, as if she were a puzzle he had almost solved. He asked her again, "Is it true?" And the crowd hushed once more. leaning in as though her answer would unlock the reason they had gathered around her. She wanted to lie, to shake her head and laugh, to pretend she did not know what they were talking about. But their eyes were too sharp, their certainty too heavy, and the lie would shatter the instant it left her mouth. She pressed her lips together, her silence only deepening the tension until it felt like the walls themselves leaned closer. The recruits shifted restlessly, now boots scraping against the floor, shoulders brushing against shoulders as if their patience was cracking. Some looked eager, their eyes shining with something close to excitement. Others looked afraid, their mouths tight and their brows furrowed, as though they wished they had not come closer. In the first place, she wondered which reaction was more dangerous, the eagerness or the fear, because either one could ignite the crowd into action. She clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white as she searched for a way to speak, a way to diffuse the rising storm, but every second she delayed only made the storm grow stronger. Then a voice cut through the air, not a whisper this time, but a shout from the back of the crowd, her full name spoken loudly for all to hear, and the mess hall fell silent in shock, because now everyone knew without question that they were not dealing with an ordinary recruit at all. She rose halfway from her seat, her hands trembling as she tried to steady the tray in front of her, though her meal had already gone cold. The recruits pressed tighter, their bodies creating a wall of uniforms that blocked every exit, and their eyes followed her every movement with a hunger she could not decipher. She knew then that whatever secret had drawn them to her would not remain hidden much longer. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, to ask how they had discovered her name. But before she could, a recruit leaned in so close she could feel his breath against her ear, and he whispered a phrase so sharp, so unexpected that her knees nearly buckled under her. She tried to convince herself she had misheard, tried to cling to the thought that it was nothing, but the way the recruits stiffened, the way their eyes widened, told her that they had heard it too. Though no one dared repeat it aloud, the mess hall air grew heavy, thick enough to choke on, as silence pressed in from every side. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm, when everyone held their breath waiting for the first crack of thunder. She could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights and the faraway rattle of the ventilation system. But beneath it all, she could sense something more, something building in the hearts of the recruits around her. The whisperer leaned back, satisfied, as though he had planted a seed and now waited for it to grow, and she could see from the corner of her eye how the recruits leaned closer, straining to catch her reaction, their faces caught between fascination and dread. She gripped the edge of the table, her nails biting into the wood as her mind raced. What could they know? What could they have guessed? She had done everything right, kept her head down, followed the rules, remained invisible. Yet here she was, cornered by dozens of recruits who all seemed certain of something she herself had never admitted aloud. She tried to slip past them, shifting her weight toward the narrow gap at her left, but the recruits noticed instantly, their boots shuffling their bodies, shifting, to close the space until the circle around her was tighter than before. She froze, realizing there was no escape. No matter how quick she was, no matter how desperate, the only way forward was through their questions and through the truth she had sworn never to reveal. The whisper still rang in her ears. She knew what it meant, and she knew that the moment she confirmed it, everything would change. A sudden crash echoed across the hall, a tray dropping from nervous hands, and the recruits flinched in unison. But no one left. No one dared break the circle. Their attention snapped back to her with renewed urgency, and she felt her pulse hammer against her ribs like a drum beat. She wanted to shout, to demand why they cared so much, to remind them that she was just another recruit like them. But even as the thought formed, she knew they would not believe her. Their eyes were too certain, their whispers too sure. They knew something they should never have known. Another recruit stepped forward, broad-shouldered and tall, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. His voice cut through the silence, low but steady, as he repeated the question. "Is it true?" And the way he asked it left no room for lies. He was not asking out. Of curiosity, he was demanding a confession. Her mouth went dry, her throat constricting as she tried to form words, but nothing came. The recruits leaned in closer. Their breaths shallow, their eyes locked on her as if the answer would either save them or doom them all. The silence stretched until it felt unbearable, and then, as if on cue, the overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the hall into total darkness. The recruits gasped and shuffled in the blackness, the sound of boots scraping across concrete filling the void. She stood frozen, her senses straining in the absence of sight, her hands gripping. The table so hard, her knuckles ached. She could feel the recruits still around her, their bodies brushing past hers, their breaths close enough to touch, but she could not see a single face in the darkness. Panic began to ripple. Some recruits shouted for light, others cursed under their breath. The sound of metal trays hitting the ground rang out as meals were abandoned, and the hall filled with chaotic noise. Yet amid the confusion, she sensed a different energy, one that pressed against her with deliberate focus. The recruits still knew where she was, even without the light. They had not scattered. They had not forgotten her. Instead, the circle remained unbroken even in the dark, and that realization chilled her more than the blackness itself. Then, a sharp crack rang out as the emergency lights sputtered on, casting the hall in a dim red glow. The light fell directly on her face while leaving most of the recruits in shadow. The gasps that followed were sharp and collective as dozens of eyes took in what the crimson light revealed. She felt exposed, as though the glow had stripped away the last layer of protection she had carried with her since arriving at the camp. Their whispers grew frantic, their certainty hardened, and she realized that whatever secret they suspected had just been confirmed without her speaking a single word. Someone shouted from the back that she should not even be here, that her presence was a violation of every regulation they had ever been taught. The voice trembled with fury and fear, and the recruits turned on her with expressions that mixed anger with disbelief. She tried to protest, tried to tell them it was not what they thought, but their voices drowned her out. Questions and accusations crashing. Over her in waves, the red light flickered again, casting their faces in and out of shadow, their eyes burning like embers in the half-darkness, and she could feel the weight of their judgment closing in. She raised her hands in surrender, her voice finally breaking through the noise as she told them to stop. But the crowd would not stop. Some shouted that she was dangerous, others insisted she was chosen. Some stared at her with wide eyes as if she were a ghost, returned from the grave she wanted, to retreat back into silence. But it was too late. The truth hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet undeniable, and the recruits knew even if they could not agree on what it meant, the secret was out, and there was no undoing it. The tall recruit who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, his shadow long in the red light, his voice cutting through the storm with command. He told the others to quiet, and somehow they obeyed, their voices fading into uneasy silence. He turned to her, his gaze piercing, and he asked again the same question, but now with authority that brooked no refusal. "Is it true?" She swallowed hard. Knowing that every path before her had collapsed except one, she could not deny it any longer. Yet she feared that admitting it would unleash something neither she nor the recruits could control. The silence deepened, every recruit leaning forward, straining to hear her answer. Her pulse raced, her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs refused to move. She opened her mouth and, for the first time, words formed on her tongue. But just as she prepared to speak, the emergency lights sputtered again, and the hall plunged back into darkness. This time the darkness was total. No hum from the lights, no faint glow from the windows, only blackness so thick it seemed to swallow the air. The recruits cried out. Some shouted her name, others cursed. The floor shook as dozens of boots moved at once. The sound of bodies colliding filled the void, but amid the chaos, she felt a hand grip. Her arm firm and unyielding, pulling her away from the table. She tried to resist, but the grip was too strong. She stumbled forward, guided through the blackness by someone she could not see, and as the hall erupted into shouting and confusion, she realized that whoever had taken hold of her had planned this moment all along. The recruits searched blindly for her, calling her name, their voices desperate, but she was already being led away, her heart pounding as she struggled to keep pace with the unseen figure guiding her through the dark. She wanted to ask who it was, where they were taking her, but her voice would not rise above the chaos. Behind them, she knew only that she was being pulled into something deeper, something far more dangerous than the circle of recruits in the mess hall, and as the grip tightened and the distance between her and the others grew, she felt the terrifying certainty that the real story was only just beginning, and that whatever secret the recruits thought they had uncovered was only the surface of a truth that would shock them all when it finally came to light. The grip on her arm did not loosen as the unseen figure guided her through the blackness of the mess hall, every step echoing loudly in her ears over the chaos of recruits shouting and colliding behind her. She stumbled over a fallen tray, the sound of clattering metal making her flinch. But the hand that held her dragged her forward without hesitation, pulling her away from the epicenter of panic. She tried to dig her heels into the floor to resist, but her boots slid against the concrete, and she realized whoever this was had the strength to move her regardless of her will. Her breath came fast, shallow gasps as she whispered for the figure to tell her who they were, but no answer came. Only the steady tug forward through the suffocating dark. She strained her eyes, but the blackness was absolute. The emergency lights had failed completely, and even the faint glow from the windows had been swallowed, as if the night itself pressed against the walls of the hall. She could hear recruits behind her, their boots scraping the floor, their voices rising in frantic confusion. Some shouted her name while others shouted accusations, each one sharp as a knife, but the grip never faltered, and she realized with growing dread that she was being taken somewhere specific, somewhere planned. They moved past the edge of the mess hall, she could tell by the sudden shift in acoustics, the walls closing tighter, the echoes sharper. She had been inside this building only a few times before she knew the mess hall connected to a narrow corridor that led toward the storage wing, and from there to the training yards. But in this darkness, she could not be certain of their path. She counted her steps, tried to map the turns, but her nerves made her lose track. She only knew that the recruits' voices grew fainter behind her until they were swallowed by the heavy silence of the hallways. Finally, the grip eased slightly, and she was pushed against a wall, her shoulder striking the cold surface as the figure leaned close. She could feel their breath hot against her ear as they whispered her name, but not with accusation, not with fear, instead with urgency, as if warning her to remain silent. She froze, the sound of that voice striking her with recognition, though she could not yet place it. The figure shifted, and for a brief moment, a faint glow appeared, a tiny spark, from a lighter that flickered long enough to reveal sharp features and eyes that looked both determined and afraid. She recognized him instantly. One of the senior recruits who had rarely spoken but had always watched quietly from the edges of drills. His name surfaced in her mind, though she had never exchanged more than a nod with him. His expression in the flickering light told her that he knew far more about her than he should. The flame died, leaving them in darkness again. But his hand remained firm on her arm as he told her in a low voice that she needed to keep moving before the others found them. She tried to demand answers, to ask why he had pulled her away, but the urgency in his tone silenced her words. He insisted there was no time as they moved again deeper into the corridor. She could hear the sound of the recruits behind them spilling into the hall, searching blindly for her, their boots striking like drums as they fanned out in every direction she and the senior recruit moved. Quickly hugging the wall, their breaths synchronized as they slipped further away. She wanted to believe he was helping her, but a gnawing suspicion clawed at her chest. What if he was delivering her to something worse than the circle of recruits? What if this was all part of the plan? They stopped abruptly as the sound of approaching boots grew louder from ahead. The senior recruit pressed her against the wall, his hand covering her mouth as a group of others passed by, their silhouettes barely visible in the faintest trace of outside light slipping in through a high window. The group whispered among themselves, their words sharp fragments, about finding her, about ending this before it spread. Her stomach churned as she realized they were not just curious anymore, they were hunting her. And she did not even know what they planned to do if they caught her. When the group passed, the senior recruit pulled her along again, leading her down a narrow stairwell that smelled of damp concrete and dust. She had never been this far down the building, and a sense of unease spread through her as the air grew colder. The stairwell seemed endless, until finally they reached a metal door at the bottom. He pushed it open with effort. The hinges groaning loudly, and they slipped into a small room lit faintly by a single emergency lamp. The door closed behind them, muffling the sound of pursuit. For the first time, she could see him clearly, the red glow of the lamp casting long shadows across. His face, his jaw tight, his eyes alert. He told her quickly that she could not stay in the open any longer, that the recruits had seen enough to believe the rumors, and once belief took root, it would spread through the camp like fire. She demanded to know what they thought they had seen, what they believed to be true about her. He hesitated, his gaze flickering as though the words themselves were dangerous. Finally, he said that they believed she was not supposed to exist here, that she was not like them. Her heart raced. She wanted to deny it, to insist that she was just another recruit. But the look in his eyes told her he already knew more than denial could erase. He leaned closer. Lowering his voice until it was barely a whisper, he said he had seen the records, that her name was not on the official lists, that her file was marked, classified, and sealed higher than any recruit should ever be. Her breath caught the world tilting. As she realized how deep the secret went, she had known she was different. She had known to keep her head down, but to hear that her entire presence had been hidden at the highest level sent fear spiraling through her. Before she could respond, the door rattled violently, someone on the other side pounding against it. The senior recruit cursed under his breath, grabbing her wrist and pulling her toward a second exit. She stumbled after him as the metal door behind them buckled under the force of the recruits outside, their voices rising in angry shouts. He dragged her into another passage, narrow and dark. The only light, the faint glow from ahead. He whispered urgently that they would not stop, now that the truth had been seen, and that she had to trust him if she wanted to survive. Her mind screamed with doubt, but her body had no choice but to follow. The pounding behind them grew louder, metal bending under the force of fists and boots. The sound echoing through the passage as they ran. The glow ahead grew brighter until they burst into the open air of the training yard, the night sky overhead heavy with clouds, the floodlights dead, leaving the yard cloaked in shadow. The cold air stung her lungs as she gasped for breath, her legs burning with the effort of running, but the senior recruit did not slow. He pulled her across the gravel toward the far end of the yard, where an old shed stood half collapsed. Inside the shed, the air was thick with dust and the smell of oil. The senior recruit slammed the door behind them, securing it with a heavy bar. He turned to her, his expression fierce. He told her she had no more time to hide, that the others would spread the story before dawn, and soon the entire camp would see her as a threat. She asked him why he cared, why he had saved her instead of joining them. His eyes darkened as he said because he had been waiting for her arrival. He had known someone like her would come. And now that she was here, nothing would ever be the same. Her pulse thundered as his words sank in. She stared at him, trying to understand, but his next words froze her in place. He said she carried something that the others could never accept, something that marked her from the moment she stepped into the camp, and if she wanted to survive, she would have to embrace it rather than run from it. She tried to ask what he meant, what exactly they thought she was, but before she could, the distant sound of shouts echoed across the yard, growing louder as the recruits spread their search and closed in again. The senior recruit grabbed her shoulders, his voice urgent, as he told her that the truth would not wait much longer, that soon she would have to reveal it not only to the recruits, but to the entire camp, because what she carried would change everything. She shook her head, fear rising in her chest. She wanted to deny it all, to believe she was just another face in the crowd, but the certainty in his eyes left no room for denial, and she realized with horror that whatever secret he spoke of was already in motion, already too far gone to stop. And as the shouts drew closer and the pounding of boots echoed across the yard, she knew that the next few moments would decide not just her fate, but the fate of everyone who had seen her that night. The shouts grew closer outside the shed, their echoes bouncing across the training yard, and her chest tightened with each step that pounded against the gravel. She pressed her back against the wall, the wood rough against her uniform, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The senior recruit stood in front of the door, his shoulders squared, his eyes scanning the cracks in the wood as if calculating how long. Before the others forced their way inside, he turned to her, his expression unreadable, and told her that once they entered there would be no more hiding, no more silence, only the truth that she had avoided since the day she arrived. Her throat closed as she tried to speak, tried to ask what truth he wanted her to reveal, but his gaze silenced her. The certainty in his face told her he already knew, and that terrified her more than the voices drawing nearer. She wondered how long he had waited for this moment, how long he had watched her from the edges of drills, keeping her secret, while also preparing for the inevitable collapse of her disguise. The pounding on the shed door began, sharp fists striking wood boots, slamming against the panel's splinters, breaking free. With each blow, the recruits shouted for her to come out, their voices a mixture of anger, fear, and something else that made her shiver, expectation. The senior recruit raised a finger to his lips, telling her to remain. Silent as he slid closer to the door, he whispered that she had two choices. Either she step into the light and admit what she was, or she let the recruits drag her out and decide her fate themselves. Her stomach twisted, her thoughts racing. She wanted to scream at him that she was no different from the rest of them, that she had sweated, bled, and trained alongside them. But deep down, she knew the lie had shattered the moment her name was spoken aloud in the mess hall. The door rattled violently, again the bar groaning under the strain, dust falling from the ceiling with every strike. Her heart hammered so loudly she wondered if the recruits outside could hear it. The senior recruit turned back to her, his jaw tight, his voice low. He told her that what came next would shock them all, that it would shake the camp to its core, and she had to be ready to stand firm when it happened. She shook her head, tears burning her eyes, but before she could protest, the wood splintered and the bar snapped, the door bursting inward as recruits poured through, their faces lit with fury and anticipation. They surrounded her once more, their shadows stretching across the shed walls, their eyes locked on her as if she were prey cornered by a pack of wolves. They shouted her name, demanded answers, pressed closer until she could feel their heat, their breath, the sound of their boots grinding against the dirt floor. She backed against the wall, nowhere left to run, her body trembling, her voice caught in her throat. The senior recruit stepped forward, raising his hand to hold them back, his voice ringing with authority as he shouted for them to listen before they acted. The recruits paused only for a heartbeat, their rage still burning in their eyes, but the weight of his command forced them to hesitate. He turned to her, gesturing sharply, as if telling her that this was the moment, that there was no turning back. Now the silence in the shed thickened, the recruits waiting their gazes. Sharp and unyielding she felt, trapped under the weight of so many eyes, every instinct screaming for her to deny everything. Yet she knew denial would crumble the instant it left her lips. The air vibrated with tension. Her hands shook as she finally forced words out of her mouth. She told them it was true, the words raw and hoarse, but loud enough for every ear in the shed to hear. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, echoing like a wave through the room. Some recruits stumbled back, their faces pale. Others surged closer, their jaws tight, their fists clenched, and still others stared at her with a strange kind of awe, as if seeing her for the first time. The voices rose again, some shouting that she was dangerous, others demanding proof, and a few whispering in tones that sounded more like prayers than accusations. She stood trembling, every muscle tense, as the reality of what she had admitted settled over the room like a storm cloud. The senior recruit spoke quickly, his voice sharp, as he reminded them that they had suspected all along, that their instincts had been right, that she was different, and that the truth could no longer be hidden. He told them that this was not cause for fear, but for reckoning that the camp would never be the same again. She wanted to stop him, to tell him he was making it worse, but the fire in his eyes told her he was not afraid. He was certain that her presence was a turning point for them all. The recruits shifted uneasily, some drawn to his conviction, others recoiling in disbelief. The shouting resumed louder than before, voices clashing over one another, anger, awe, terror, all colliding until the shed shook with the force of it. She pressed her back harder against the wall, her knees weak, her vision swimming as if the weight of their judgment was crushing her. She thought for a moment they would tear her apart right there in the shed. But then the senior recruit raised his voice above the chaos, his words cutting through. Like a blade, he declared that if they touched her, they would face him first, and his stance, his unflinching gaze, froze them long enough for the room to fall silent again. The recruits stared at him, then at her, torn between two forces, between the fear of what she represented and the command in his presence. One of them finally stepped forward, his voice shaking as he demanded to know what she was, exactly. His words breaking the silence like glass. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Only the rush of air as the truth clawed at her throat. She wanted to speak, to explain, to tell them everything, but the words refused to form, and instead the senior recruit answered for her. His tone steady, he told them she was the one they had been, warned about the one who was never meant to stand among them, and yet here she was.